The holidays always stirred something soft inside me, a quiet hope I tried not to expose too much. After a year with Robert, I thought I finally understood the careful rhythm of his guarded heart. He wasn't warm in the obvious ways, but he cared in small gestures that felt sincere. And with Christmas lights appearing in every window, I imagined this would be the year he finally opened the door to the part of his life he kept hidden. I pictured meeting his parents, hearing old stories, being part of something bigger than just the two of us. I thought I'd finally step inside his world instead of staying on the outside looking in. But his past had always been a mystery wrapped in polite avoidance. No photos on the walls, no framed childhood memories, no casual mentioned cousins or family jokes. Whenever friends talked about their holiday plans, I'd laugh along, pretending mine included more than wishful thinking. Deep down, though, I felt that tiny sting, the one that says you're loving someone who moves through life with the curtains closed. Still, I kept telling myself that some people simply take longer to let others in, and maybe I was finally getting close. So when December rolled in, I felt a familiar flutter of excitement, like something good was finally on its way. I imagined us traveling together, sharing long talks on the plane, holding hands as we walked into his parents' home. I imagined belonging. But as the days passed, a strange tension settled in my chest, the kind that warns you before the truth even arrives. Something felt off, but I pushed it down, convincing myself I was overthinking. I had no idea my quiet hope was about to collide with something far darker. I remember the moment I brought it up, trying to sound casual even though my heart was thudding louder than my voice. "So, have you figured out the travel dates to visit your parents?" I asked, pretending it was idle conversation, pretending I didn't already imagine myself by his side. He didn't even look up right away. When he finally did, his answer was clipped, distant, like he was reading from a script he'd rehearsed alone. "Yeah, I'll be gone for about a week." Just like that. No warmth, no invitation, nothing that hinted I belonged. Still, I pushed forward, forcing a smile that felt painfully tight. "And am I going with you?" I tried to keep my voice light, but hope leaked through the cracks anyway. His eyes didn't soften. In fact, they seemed to harden, as if the question itself annoyed him. "Not this year," he said. "It's just family stuff. Really boring. You wouldn't like it." And the way he said it, so final, so dismissive, felt like a slow twist in my stomach. I nodded, even though everything inside me sank. But I knew Robert. Or at least, I thought I did. He had always been reserved, someone who guarded his life like it could slip away if anyone looked too closely. No social media, barely any friends, and a family he treated like a topic marked off limits. I told myself he was just private, not secretive. I told myself not to spiral. But that familiar anxiety crept in anyway, whispering sharp little questions I didn't want to hear. What if he wasn't protecting his privacy? What if he was protecting something, or someone, else? That night, the questions wouldn't stop circling my mind, each one tightening around me like a rope pulled a little too hard. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying his tone, his distance, the way he shut the door on a part of his life I'd never been allowed to see. I kept trying to rationalize it, telling myself he was overwhelmed, stressed, tired, anything but dishonest. But underneath those excuses lived a fear I couldn't ignore anymore, a fear that maybe I wasn't someone he was proud to bring home. By midnight, my heartbeat felt louder than the quiet apartment. I got up, walked around, made tea I didn't drink. I thought about every moment he'd avoided talking about his family, every time he'd changed the subject or brushed something off, and with each memory, jealousy whispered a little louder, feeding on uncertainty, on silence, on the unknown. What if he wasn't just keeping me away? What if there was something or someone already there? By the time dawn started breaking through the blinds, something inside me snapped into place. It wasn't anger. It wasn't desperation. It was clarity. A painful, sharp kind of clarity that pushed me toward a choice I never imagined making. With shaking hands, I opened his suitcase and placed a small tracking device inside, tucking it beneath his clothes. It felt wrong and yet terrifyingly right. If he wouldn't let me into his world, then I'd find another way to see it. And somewhere deep inside, I already knew this choice would lead me to an answer I wasn't ready for. 2 days later, I stood by the window watching Robert load his suitcase into the trunk, my heart pounding in a rhythm that didn't feel entirely my own. He kissed my forehead before leaving, a gesture that should have comforted me but instead felt strangely hollow. The moment he drove off, I opened the tracking app, my thumb hovering over the screen like I was afraid of touching the truth. And then the little dot began to move, slowly at first, then gliding across the map toward the airport. It felt surreal, watching his path unfold in real time, almost like peeking behind a curtain I was never meant to lift. Hours dragged by, each one stretching my nerves thinner. When the dot finally stopped, my breath hitched, because I knew this was it, the address he'd called his parents' house. A simple label, so harmless, yet suddenly loaded with tension, I could feel creeping into my bones. I stared at the screen as if it held all the answers to every question that had haunted me for months. Part of me hoped the truth would be ordinary and boring, exactly how he'd described it. But another part of me, the part that had been ignored too many times, braced for impact. Curiosity battled fear until they both blur into something reckless. I told myself I just needed to see where he was staying, to reassure the part of me he kept denying air. Without planning, without even pausing to think, I booked the next flight. I packed a bag with trembling hands, barely noticing what I threw inside. The decision felt wild, but also inevitable. By the time I boarded the plane, one thought kept echoing through me like a warning bell. If he had nothing to hide, why was I so scared of discovering the truth? When the plane landed, my nerves felt like they'd been scraped raw. I kept checking the app as if the dot might suddenly vanish, proving this whole trip was nothing more than paranoia. But it stayed right where it had stopped hours earlier, anchored to that quiet residential street. I climbed into a taxi, my hands trembling in my lap, trying to steady my breathing while the city blurred past the windows. Every mile felt heavier than the last, as though I was being pulled toward a truth I couldn't walk away from anymore. And with every passing second, the silence inside that car grew louder. When the taxi turned into the neighborhood, something inside me shifted. The houses were warm, decorated with twinkling lights, the kind that usually made me smile this time of year. But tonight, the glow only made me feel like an outsider stepping into someone else's holiday picture. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as we slowed in front of a charming 2-story home, the exact address the tracker showed. For a moment, I couldn't move. The idea that Robert's entire hidden world was behind those walls felt unreal, almost cruel. But I forced myself out of the car because I needed answers more than comfort. As I walked toward the door, every step felt like crossing a line I could never uncross. My palms were damp, my breath sharp, and yet I kept going. I knocked, my knuckles sounding far braver than I felt. When the door opened, I expected, I don't know, maybe an older woman with Robert's eyes, maybe the smell of holiday cooking and family warmth. Instead, a stunning woman my age stood there, confident, composed, and completely unfamiliar. And the way she looked at me, with that polite confusion, sent a cold wave through my chest even before she spoke. "Hi, can I help you?" she asked, and her tone was gentle enough, but something about her presence made my throat tighten. I tried to steady myself, clinging to the version of reality I had believed in for a year. "Yes," I said, forcing confidence I didn't feel. "I'm here because my boyfriend, Robert, asked me to come." For a second, she just stared at me, her brows knitting together in confusion. Then her frown deepened, and I felt the air between us shift, like I had said something impossible, something outrageous. "Boyfriend? Of Robert? What are you talking about?" she asked, and her voice trembled just enough to make my stomach twist. Irritation flared through me, fueled by fear I didn't want to name. "Exactly that," I snapped. "Robert. Tall, brown hair, lawyer." I didn't even finish before I saw it hit her. Her eyes widened, and the color drained from her face as if my words cracked open a truth she had never considered. The silence that followed was suffocating, stretching long enough for dread to settle deep inside my ribs. Finally, she whispered, "I'm sorry, but Robert's girlfriend is already here. She's sitting at the table with us." The world tilted. For a moment, I could swear the ground moved under my feet. My thoughts scattered like broken glass, sharp and impossible to gather. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. It felt like someone had kicked me straight in the chest, knocking the air out of me. And in that moment, raw, stunned, trembling, I realized the truth I had never dared to imagine was waiting for me inside that house. I didn't wait for permission. Shock and adrenaline fused into something fierce, pushing me past the woman at the door before she could say another word. My footsteps echoed through the hallway, my pulse pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. And then I saw them. Robert, laughing, relaxed, completely at home in a world he'd never even allowed me to glimpse. And beside him sat another woman, her hand resting comfortably in his, like it belonged there. The sight hit me so hard my breath came out in a broken gasp. For a moment, the room froze. His smile vanished the second he saw me, his face draining of color so quickly it almost satisfied me. Almost. "Alyssa!" he blurted out, stumbling to his feet, shock twisting his features into something ugly and panicked. But I couldn't hold back anymore. All the doubt, all the hope, all the emotional gymnastics I had done for him erupted at once. "Robert, what the hell is going on?" My voice cracked, but it was loud enough to shatter whatever illusion he had built here. The woman beside him, his other girlfriend, looked up with heartbreak blooming slowly across her face. "I'm his girlfriend," she said softly, almost in disbelief. "I've been with him for years." Her voice trembled as though she couldn't make sense of the words coming out of her own mouth. I felt my knees weaken as I fired back. "Years? I've been with him for a year." And the way the room reacted, the stunned silence, the shame on Robert's face, the horror settling around the Christmas table, told me everything I needed to know. His lies were deeper than I had ever imagined. Before I could catch my breath, an older woman walked into the room, Robert's mother. I recognized her from the few vague descriptions he'd given, and even those suddenly felt like lies. She took one look at the scene, at the two women standing there broken and furious, and at her son who seemed to be shrinking by the second. "Robert," she said, her voice low and trembling with disappointment, "please tell me you didn't bring two girlfriends into my house." Hearing it out loud made my chest tighten. The humiliation settled like a weight on my shoulders. Robert tried to speak, but the words came out in fragments, each one more pathetic than the last. It's not what it looks like," he stammered, desperate to grab onto whatever dignity he had left. But I wasn't giving him a lifeline. Not after everything he'd stolen from me, my trust, my time, my holiday hope. "Yes, it is," I fired back. "You've been dating us both." The other woman looked at him, tears forming, her voice barely a whisper. "Robert, is this true?" The silence that followed was his confession. He took a small step toward her, towards me, towards the disaster he'd created. "I can explain," he tried again, his voice cracking. But his explanations were just more noise, empty, weak, insulting. I felt heat rush up my throat as I said, "Don't bother. You treated me like your dirty secret." The words tasted bitter, but also liberating, like ripping off a bandage I'd ignored for too long. And for the first time that night, I saw the truth in his eyes. He hadn't expected either of us to ever know the other existed. Robert's mother pressed a hand to her forehead, as if the weight of his choices physically pained her. His father appeared in the doorway a moment later, drawn by the noise, and the disappointment on his face was even sharper. They looked at their son not with anger, but with disbelief, as though they were realizing they didn't truly know him. "You should be ashamed," his father murmured, and the quiet firmness of those words cut deeper than any yelling could have. For the first time, Robert seemed small, exposed, cornered by the truth he had created with his own lies. Meanwhile, his long-term girlfriend stood frozen, heartbreak spreading across her features like a slow collapse. She wiped her eyes, her voice trembling as she asked, "How long has this been going on?" Robert opened his mouth again, and once more, nothing honest came out. Just stutters, excuses, fragments of nothing. I felt something inside me shift, not rage, not sadness, but clarity. A clarity so sharp it felt almost freeing. I wasn't going to crumble in front of him. I wasn't going to be another woman swallowed by his deceit. I took a slow breath, grounding myself in the moment, letting the truth settle around us like a storm finally reaching its peak. My heart still ached, yes, but beneath it was a growing resolve, a realization that this confrontation wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of seeing him for who he really was. And while everyone else in the room stood stunned or shattered, I felt a quiet, steady strength forming inside me. A strength that whispered, "Not all of this ends here. Not yet." The shouting eventually softened into exhausted murmurs, the kind that fill a room when everyone has run out of denial to hide behind. I sat on the edge of a chair, my hands trembling, listening as the truth spilled out piece by piece. Robert had been with her, his real girlfriend, for 5 years. 5 holidays, 5 birthdays, 5 entire seasons of memories he never once shared with me. Hearing it felt like watching the floor crack open beneath me. A whole life he'd built with her, while holding me off to the side like some temporary distraction he assumed would never collide with reality. He explained it in the weakest terms imaginable, each confession landing like another slap. He had been bored, he said. He didn't think it would go this far. He didn't expect me to matter. Those were his words, careless, hollow, delivered with the tone of someone who still believed his intentions softened the blow. But every syllable carved deeper, revealing a truth that was somehow worse than the betrayal itself. I had never existed in his future. I was a placeholder, a convenient secret he assumed would fade away quietly. "What was I to you?" I finally asked, my voice barely holding itself together. His eyes dropped to the floor, as if the answer embarrassed him. "I didn't think you'd find out," he said. That was it. No remorse. No real accountability. Just the fear of being caught. In that moment, something in me hardened. Not in cruelty, but in clarity. I realized he wasn't sorry about what he'd done. He was sorry the lie had collapsed. And I knew then that whatever came next wouldn't be about comforting him. It would be about reclaiming myself. Robert tried to step closer to me, but I could feel my entire body recoil before he even moved an inch. "Alyssa, please," he said, reaching out like his touch could somehow erase everything he had confessed. "I never wanted to hurt you." The words sounded rehearsed, like something he'd pulled from a generic apology shelf he'd used before. I stared at him, feeling strangely detached, like I was watching someone else's heartbreak happen from a distance. "You didn't even consider me," I said quietly. "I wasn't part of your future, just your convenience." And saying it aloud felt like finally naming a wound that had been growing in silence. His parents stood behind him, their expressions stiff with disappointment. Disappointment not only in what he'd done, but in the man he'd chosen to be. His father's jaw clenched, and his mother's eyes glistened with a sorrow that didn't belong to me. It belonged to them. "You should leave," his father told him firmly. "Both of you. I raised you better than this." But Robert didn't move. He just stood there, suspended between the two lives that had just collided, like a child who'd been caught doing something unforgivable and still didn't understand the magnitude of it. The other woman, his true long-term girlfriend, finally sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands. Her sobs were soft but painfully raw, each one echoing through the room like a reminder of the years she'd invested in him. I wanted to comfort her, but I also wanted to scream. Instead, I stood there frozen, feeling my heartbeat slow from panic into something steadier, almost resolute. The tears I expected never came. Not because I wasn't hurting, but because some deeper instinct inside me had begun to awaken. I wasn't going to fall apart. I wasn't going to be defined by this moment. Not when the truth had finally set something powerful in motion within me. As the chaos simmered into tired silence, something inside me shifted in a way I couldn't fully describe. It wasn't numbness. Not exactly. It was more like a quiet recalibration, as if my heart had drawn a hard boundary right in front of him. I looked at Robert, really looked at him, and for the first time since this began, I didn't see the man I'd loved for a year. I saw a stranger who had borrowed pieces of affection and trust he never intended to return. And that realization didn't break me. It steadied me. He tried one last time, voice trembling with panic he could no longer hide. "Alyssa, please. I can fix this." But his words rang empty in the air between us. I didn't owe him reassurance. I didn't owe him understanding. What I owed, to myself, was the truth. And the truth was that he had made choices with a kind of carelessness that deserved consequences, not forgiveness. "You can't fix something you never built honestly," I said, and the sting in his eyes told me he finally understood that I was done cushioning his fall. I stepped back, taking in the wreckage of the night, the untouched Christmas plates, the cooling food, the decorations meant for warmth now shadowed by betrayal. Somehow, that contrast grounded me, reminding me that heartbreak doesn't erase a person. It refines them. I wasn't collapsing. I wasn't lost. I felt something rising inside me, a steady, deliberate strength that whispered I deserved better than surviving his lies. And as I turned toward the door, I understood this wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment I decided to reclaim it. When I stepped out of that house, the cold winter air hit me like a slap, sharp, bracing, and strangely invigorating. It didn't wash away the hurt, but it cleared my mind in a way I desperately needed. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't fall apart on the sidewalk the way old versions of me might have. Instead, a strange calm settled over me, as if clarity had finally chosen to sit beside me in the passenger seat of my own life. Robert expected chaos. He expected a meltdown. He expected me to chase answers or closure. I wasn't giving him any of that. Instead of blocking him, I left every door open, quietly, strategically. I wanted him to wonder what version of me he'd awakened. I wanted him to feel the uncertainty I had carried for a year. And as the hours passed, I did something I never imagined I'd be capable of. I documented everything. Photos of the dining room with both women present, screenshots of our messages exposing every lie, audio recordings of his stuttered confessions. With every piece I collected, the tremble in my hands faded. Purpose took its place. There was a strange power in gathering the very truth he thought would stay buried forever. Not power born from cruelty, but from justice. Justice for the year he stole from me, for the hope he manipulated, for the deceit he wrapped in affection. As I looked through the evidence, piece by piece, I realized I wasn't doing this to hurt him. I was doing it to free myself, to make sure his lies didn't define my story or hers. And with that realization, a plan began to form. Quiet, deliberate, cold as the winter night around me. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. No shaking hands, no racing thoughts, just a steady determination humming beneath my skin. I opened my laptop, laid out every piece of evidence like a puzzle finally ready to be assembled, and began deciding who needed to see the truth first. His workplace HR, his professional licensing board, his parents, and most important of all, the woman who had loved him far longer than I had. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't acting out of rage. Every decision felt precise, measured, almost clinical. The emails I drafted weren't emotional or dramatic. They were factual, calm, and impossible to ignore. I attached the photos of us in the same house, screenshots of messages contradicting everything he'd ever told his family, and the recordings where he admitted the double life he'd orchestrated. Each click of the send button felt like reclaiming a part of myself he'd diminished with lies. And the more I sent, the more my breathing slowed, grounding me in a sense of justice I hadn't known I was capable of demanding. Then came the message to his long-term girlfriend. I stared at her contact photo for a long moment, feeling a heaviness that wasn't anger. It was empathy. She'd built years with him, years that he'd tainted with deception. When I finally typed, my words were gentle. "I'm sorry you had to find out like this, but he lied to both of us. And you deserve someone who chooses you." Sending it felt like offering her a handout of a sinking ship, not pushing her further under. And in that moment, I realized my revenge wasn't about ruining him. It was about rescuing myself and giving her the truth she deserved. The fallout didn't take long. By evening, my phone buzzed with messages I didn't need to open to understand. His girlfriend had left him. His parents had confronted him. His co-workers had seen the evidence. His licensing board had flagged his conduct for review. One by one, the pillars of the carefully curated life he'd built on charm, deceit, and borrowed truths, began to crack. And for once, he was the one scrambling, the one panicking, the one trying to hold together a world he never imagined would collapse. All because a truth he thought he controlled finally slipped through his fingers. When he called me, his voice wasn't confident or dismissive or casual. It was desperate. "Alyssa, please, can we talk?" he begged, as if a conversation could patch over the wreckage of a double life. I listened, not out of softness, but out of closure. "There's nothing left to say," I told him, my tone steady and unshaken. "I only exposed what you created." His breath hitched, anger bleeding through the panic. "You ruined my life!" he shouted. I almost laughed at the irony. "No," I replied. "You ruined mine first. I just returned your gift." And then I let the silence speak for me as I ended the call. When I walked outside later that night, the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and winter fires from neighborhood chimneys. Christmas lights twinkled on rooftops, soft and steady, like they were breathing with the night. And for the first time in days, maybe weeks, I felt something settle inside me. Not revenge, not triumph, but peace. A quiet peace that came from knowing I chose myself when he never would have. I wasn't leaving this chapter broken. I was leaving it wiser, stronger, and finally free from the weight of a man who never deserved the love he wasted.